struggled a little with this presentation. I'm wondering what else there is to say that I haven't already written and said on the topic. So I hope I'm not boring you. But you know, some of the points on children's work, it's still very much a contentious issue, and public things and documents are still coming out. So what I'm doing is attaching what I'm saying to a number of recent documents. And I want to start with what's almost a diversion. A recent study, Seven Children India, produced this on child labour in the garment industry in Delhi. I don't want to go into it in detail, but a few small points about it. It was based on 170 children. 148 of them were working in the homes on piecework with their families. 22 were in ADAS, I don't know if I got the pronunciation right, but small informal factories. On the household, these are children, they learn the trade from very early years. The tiny kids do easy jobs and then they become more competent to do others. And we have this statement: most children do not mind doing some work during the evenings and kept them occupied, was found to be interesting. Some in fact enjoy doing the work. There's a sense of pride amongst the children that they can undertake such work. Young children enthusiastically explained how it took them just 10 minutes to finish pasting stones on an entire neck piece. And yet, there was some problems with the work. They didn't offer any evidence that it was keeping them from school. Pretty well all of these children were attending school. And yet, the policy of Save the Children is to withdraw the children from this work. And one of the issues that the children raise is sometimes they have eye strain because they have to work in such poor light. And the reason why they have to work in such poor light is they have to keep the doors and shutters closed because people are trying to stop them. So, just leave it at that in a moment. There seems to be a divergence between policy and what the children are telling them. Then we have the ADAS, and they're more problematic. The working conditions are bad, hours are long, very few of these managed to get to school at all, and there were those who started at school dropped out. Nevertheless, 91% of them wanted to continue this work as adults. They were being apprenticed to it, they were learning it. Save the Children had these raid and rescue policy, raiding the ADAS and underage children being sent home. They pointed out that some of the children who were sent home to their villages turned up again fairly shortly afterwards at the ADAS, and explained that the children found no hope for at home. There was much poverty, and here in the ADAS, in spite of the hard-working conditions, they were learning and they had hope for the future. Here's a small point that comes out on page 86. They say 14 of the 23 respondents working with ADAS said that their employers were caring. 8 said that their behavior was neutral. And right on the same page, you have this illustration of the employer and the children. And what's happening here? How is it that you get great rescue campaigns? At least they can be very harrowing for children, very traumatic. And I don't know if any of you are interested, but the CWC, Concern for Working Children in Bangalore, the children they are supporting, produced a documentary on stopping child labour. And part of their campaign being saying that make sure that against child labour is not against child. And they had, this documentary starts with nightmares the kids get after being caught up in one of these raid and rescue campaigns. So what I'm asking is, when I look at that document about to Save the Children, you've got people who are really concerned about children, really concerned to help them, and I met one of the key authors, and yet somehow in their policy forgetting what the children have told them and going in a different direction. And that's why I think this concept of child labour really means we need to go on going over it and over it again and trying to work out what is involved in it. This work is classified as child labour, therefore its technical advantages must be abolished. So, oh, sorry, let me go on from that. I'm not sure that child labour qualifies as a theoretical concept. A concept is supposed to be an abstract idea, and this term covers a variety of ideas. But it does affect the way people think and behave, and the way people think about childhood. So I think it is worth considering it, and considering it seriously. Now, when I prepared this paper, and I've revised it, trying to adjust it for this conference or workshop, I used a lot of the ideas that came from a workshop we had in Addis Ababa in 2014, and it came out last year in the book, Children's Work and Labour in East Africa. There are quite a lot of the papers there on street children and others. There was, and particularly a long paper from the Young Lives Project on children and work in Ethiopia. I'm going to refer to these, and that's why I mentioned it here. We didn't have agreement at the workshop. There were some who really wanted to support international standards. There were others who thought that we've got to be much more attentive to children's context. But I think some of the material that comes out there I will be referring to, and it shows that the topic is still topical. But before we actually discuss child labour, I want to emphasize the normalcy of children's work. As social beings, we have evolved instinctively to participate in the activities and thinking of those around us. I think that's straightforward. We know how children imitate whatever's happening about them. Playfully at first, but they grow in competence. Whether you're thinking of playing at household work or cooking or whatever, they do it. And that's how children learn their culture, with its values and behavior patterns. You imitate the people. You learn language. And that's how they establish relationships with those around them. And that's how they learn certain skills. Housework is learned that way. In much of the world, agriculture is learned that way. And that's not just in Africa, that also happens in farms in the United States. Household crafts are learned that way, enterprises are learned that way. So work is part of, for most children, part of the activities around them, which they begin to participate in, and they learn as they participate. So the question is not why children work, but perhaps why some children do not work. And for vast number of children's work is central to their lives. Now, on that issue, on the kinds of work, of course, it could be all sorts of work. It could be entrepreneurial work, it can be for money. In the Ethiopian study, children were going with their families or with their older siblings, doing piecework. So they're slowly participating in the work that others are doing, and whether it's economic or not is totally irrelevant to them. Now, that does not mean that you can't have different kinds of very exploitative work, but for the most part, the issue is not whether it's economic or not, but it's whether they are participating in their family. In middle-class families and in working-class families in the industrialized world, places of work are separated from places of living. And that's where you get this concept of children not working, because work is somewhere else, they don't participate in it. There's an argument that normal employment or standard employment is on the decline even in the developed world, and that work takes place in homes much more. But I think the point is, for much of the world's children, work is not separated from living. Work is part of living and part of life. So when we look at work in this way, then we can think of work as integral to life and benefits. I think possibly going on from that, there's been some talk about Bolivia, and possibly we'll hear more about it. But one of the issues in Bolivia was that has been raised is that in indigenous societies, a lot of children are involved in work within the family, even though it's economic work. And this has to be separated from work which is very exploitative when they're working outside. And the trouble is, international standards don't always make this kind of distinction. Let's look at some of the benefits that arise from work if we understand its integral place in life. One of the obvious ones is it contributes to the livelihoods of children and their families. Now, this is especially true in situations of poverty, extreme poverty, or in response to shocks. And the Ethiopian studies show that children are very dominant in responding to economic shocks in the families. When children have inadequate or no adult support, orphans and things like that, then children have to work to earn their livelihoods. Now, this is somewhat different from the kind of participatory work I was just talking about, but it's not totally divorced. And at this level, a lot of people, even those who are strongly opposed to child labour and want to abolish it, see that in certain circumstances it's quite important for children. And you get an attitude that where it's absolutely necessary, it's tolerated. And I think that's partly right. But I think we want to go beyond simply tolerating work and saying it's not simply the economic aspects that are beneficial to children. Work, both economic and domestic, is embedded in and contributes to social relations and families. And that again was the Young Lives study in Ethiopia. It was one of the key issues. And I think it's important to understand work in this way. And if we come back to interventions against child labour and rescuing children from child labour, very often they're very disruptive of social relations and of their lives. And this can be quite damaging. Another thing that came out of the Ethiopian study was that children enter into work gradually and they learn social and life skills. And this seems much more important than entering at a particular time. And this is particularly clear in the agricultural communities, where children are gradually getting into work, not only in their own family farms, but working for money on neighbouring farms. It's a gradual entrance into work, very often with their older siblings or with other members of the family or with members of their community, and they're learning the skills about work and social skills through work. And lots of ethnographic studies all over the world point out that you are learning social skills when you're working within the community and the family. There are problems with the work, and one of the key problems in the Ethiopian study was balancing school and work. And the studies there pointed out that very often neither the schools nor the adults in the families really helped the children. It was left to the children to work out how to create the balance and to split their time between school and work and the demands of it. So it did have problems, and it certainly had problems for some children, particularly poor children who were forced to work a little more after economic shocks, and it did interfere with schools in ways they did not like. But generally, the dominant attitude to work, I mean, the question of why do you work to the Ethiopian children was a bizarre question. Well, everybody works. And working makes you feel good. It makes you, they talk about feeling blessed, whether blessed by their parents or blessed by God. It's a good feeling from working. And yeah, the alternative to work is being lazy, and that's the case in many cultures. I think related to the good feelings about the work is to realize that many children actually enjoy the work that they do. They want to work partly for social reasons, to be with their peers, particularly as they get a bit older. And the assumption that children are always forced to work or made to work is very often a false assumption. Where it does happen, of course, that is much more problematic. That's what we should be looking at. And a key issue, I think, that's brought out is through work, children experience and develop social responsibility. They like to contribute to their families. They like to believe they are supporting their families. And it has been pointed out that in the trauma following shocks, contributing to overcoming the shocks can help towards resilience. So, in many societies, in African societies and throughout the world, children's work, whether economic or not, is seen as a normal human activity, integral to children's development. Sorry, there's another. Participate in the life of communities. So what happens when we start talking about child labour? Well, certainly work can go wrong. And even when children want to work, it doesn't mean that might be their solution to a particular problem, but it's not necessarily the ideal solution even for them. We have to work to eat, we have to work in order to go to school. Well, they shouldn't have to work in order to eat, and they shouldn't have to work in order to go to school. But the solution to the problem is not to take away the children's solution, but to find another solution and a better one. So even there, we've got to look. But the trouble with talking about child labour is that, sorry. That needs help. Sorry, draw my attention and just draw the button. So the concept of child labour, it's very often defined as harmful work. I'll come back to that. It focuses on harm and ignores benefits. It treats labour as something to be abolished. And there are two major problems that I want to focus with this concept. One is by focusing on harm, it obscures the fact that much work has potential for both benefits and harm. People often try to talk about distinguishing child labour, which is harmful and in some way or hazardous, from child work, which is either neutral or benign. But a lot of work has compensating benefits, and children are very often themselves weighing risks against benefits. And with a lot of activities we have to do this, and certainly the families are doing that. And so the way we deal with the harm in children's work, sorry, if you're thinking simply in terms of harmful work, then if you abolish it, the children are not at risk. If you're thinking of harm and benefits, then you've got to try and find ways of eliminating or minimizing the harm and protecting the benefits. And so you get a totally different attitude to intervention. But the biggest problem with the concept of child labour, it conflates two different kinds of activity. And I'm going to basically conflates the idea of child labour, often defined as harmful work, with standards about age of employment. And I'm going to illustrate that with a recent document. It's brought out very recently by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, and it's a handbook for monitoring and evaluation of child labour in agriculture. Something that is very much needed, because children are very often abused in agriculture. Even in family agriculture, the work can get in the way of development schooling can be dangerous with this exercise. But what happens in this handbook? They define child labour, as I've just said, as work that impairs children's well-being or hinders their education, development, and future livelihoods. That's a very standard kind of definition that follows ILO and other organizations. But when we come to monitoring and assessment, age of employment becomes the dominant criterion. Nowhere do they discuss a movement away from harm to age of employment. Nowhere do they discuss whether age of employment corresponds to harmful work. And in fact, I know of no research that produces that correspondence. They do consider harm and harmful work, but only for elder children. For younger children, it's just simply they must be stopped. And when you come to assessment of child labour, the first thing is how many children under the minimum age are involved. Benefits are not considered at all in the assessment. They do mention the fact that children like to contribute their families, but this is one of the challenges that you have to face in the supply of child labour. They mention that it is perceived that children learn skills through their work. Again, this is one of the supply factors and it's a challenge. Nowhere do they try and assess whether the children are in fact learning skills. Nowhere do they try to assess the social relations that have been developed through work. So the monitoring and assessment is more about whether international standards of minimum age is being assessed rather than whether children are benefiting or being harmed by work. And this seems to me a huge mismatch between what they claim to be doing and what in fact is happening. And I think, I'm bringing this up, this is the one example, but you'll find it all over the place. I mean, there are lots of documents like this. They define child labour. The classic statement is, child labour is what takes away children's childhood. You can actually think of that. You actually can't take away childhood. You can disrupt it, you can make it difficult, but that, to me, sounds ethnocentric for a start. But then it's defined in terms of hazards, interfering with schooling, harm in different ways, and immediately you come to implementation, you slip into age of employment. It's not obvious, I mean, I know no researchers try to make this correlation. This leads us to the issue of the minimum age of employment. The ILO Convention 138, which demands a general minimum age of employment not lower than the age of compulsory schooling. This convention, as probably most of you know, originally passed in 1973, ratified by very few developing countries in the first 20 years of its life. But since the 1980s, it has been pushed very strongly by ILO and other organizations, and more countries are ratifying it and implementing it. There are still some exceptions. New Zealand is one, and Canada is one, and they're reconsidering it. And I think both of those, one of the key issues is consideration of indigenous peoples and their attitudes to work and how it fits in. But part of the implementation, now the impetus comes following the UNCRC and Article 32 of that. Section 1 of Article 32 states the rights of children to be protected from work that is in any way harmful or exploitative or hazardous, and I don't think anyone has any exceptions to that. Section 2, however, starts it aims to provide the protection through legislation that pays attention to age and conditions of employment rather than to harm or exploitation. There are different ways of interpreting that section 2. But it's quite widely interpreted as supporting the ILO minimum age of employment. The more recent ILO Convention 182 on the worst forms of child labour prohibits work that is harmful or hazardous in any way, or hinders development in any way, irrespective of age. And logically, and I believe when 182 was first being worked on, it was precisely to overcome the problems with 138. Logically, 138 should become obsolete, because if all harmful work is prohibited by 182, the only thing 138, the Minimum Age Convention, has is work that is not in any way harmful, but is under a particular age. And the problems with the Minimum Age Convention: it pays no attention to work by older children above the minimum age and their conditions. It exempts unpaid domestic work and unpaid work for subsistence. And so it fails to protect children in these kinds of work. And you probably all realize, lots of studies have shown that domestic work, particularly of girls, interferes with schoolwork. That's not indicated. And yet, following the thinking of this convention, if you look at the UNICEF suggestion for classification of child labour among children aged 5 to 11, they say, during the preceding week, the child did at least 1 hour of economic activity. That makes a child labour to be abolished. Or at least 28 hours of domestic work. There is no empirical reason either to limit economic work, such as, rearing chickens in a family project or farming or things like that, to 1 hour a week. Lots of people, lots of children do it. And there's certainly no reason to allow up to 28 hours of domestic work a week for school-going children. So you've got here a definition of child labour which pays no attention to harm, no attention to children's development, but it's simply about age and economic activity. Many people assume that a minimum age of employment protects children's rights to schooling. However, many children take up work as a consequence of failures in the school system. Either they are doing badly at school, or the schools are of poor quality, and the children are looking for something else, or as one child in India in the Young Life Studies comment, to rely on school for future employment is a risky business. But failures in the school, children often drive people from work, and it's amazing how often you will see correlations between work on the one hand and poor school outcomes on the other, and say this shows the effect of work on school, totally ignoring the fact that these correlations often show the other way around, the effects of school on work. And stopping children from working very rarely drives them to school. Improving school very often reduces the amount of time spent on work. Lots of studies have shown that. There are specific instances where you can push children into school by stopping the work, but that has not been generally shown to happen. And more important is that education should be directed to the development of the child's personality, talents, and mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential, and also to the preparation of the child for responsible life. That's in the CRC. These aims go beyond what most schools in the global south, sorry about that term, can offer, or a lot of schools I know can offer. And especially when you consider that in many societies, development of children, the social development, is considered equally important, or perhaps more important, than the kind of intellectual capacities. I know Robert Serpil, studying children, he's concerned with education in Zambia. He said if you ask parents what makes an intelligent child, they'll look at social responsibility and social ability as much as school ability. And schools in the colonial system tend to be very competitive rather than supportive. In fact, when children help each other with their homework, they get punished. So the values, the social values that children need to learn to become responsible members of society are often not taught in school. They have to be taught or learnt in other activities. And work, and this is shown in other ways, so work can often be considered complementary to school as part of children's education, and particularly for children who are not doing particularly well at school. Very rarely do studies about work in school look at the aptitude of children. I'm not sure how you do to but clearly children at the top of the class get different things from school than children at the bottom of the class. And children at the bottom of the class are looking for positive experiences outside school. And this has been shown in studies in America as well as studies in Africa and elsewhere. And the problem with the minimum age convention lies partly in the concept of employment that fails to consider adequately children's participation in family enterprises, but also in other kinds of work. A recent study on child domestic work in Nigeria by Gankan Tambo, she points out that child domestic work cannot be embedded in forms, well, at least it can sometimes be embedded in forms of socialization. The children need protection and they are often abused in that. That's not the issue. But the issue is to just simply think of this as employment doesn't cover what's actually happening. And if you try and classify some kinds of work, either with family or extended family, as not employment, and other kinds of work as employment, you miss the point that some children are being abused, whether they're with their family or not, and some children are being treated very well and being encouraged, whether they're with their family or not. So if you're thinking simply in terms of employment, you miss these nuances of work in different kinds of situations. So what we have very often is a mismatch between aims of protecting children from exploitation and harm on the one hand, and forbidding economic activity below a certain age on the other. And this mismatch produces a number of anomalies. It distracts attention from harmful work above the minimum age or outside economic activities, which I've already mentioned. It quite often deprives children of the best jobs, which are with employers who are concerned with conscientious employers. They will not provide children with holiday or part-time jobs for fear of employing child labor or the stigma. Recently, a program in Egypt tried to remove children from hazardous work. They were dealing with children aged 12 to 18 by finding them safe employment. It was able to find safe work for older youths, above 15, but employers who had to meet requirements of European buyers in the industry would not employ anyone under 15. So the younger children who still felt or needed to work remained in the most hazardous kinds of work. One example was a lead smelting factory. You get all the older children out, but the younger children were left there. Something that came up at this workshop is supporting for working children. And quite often, the minimum age convention means that the younger children are not supported. Because if they go to the support groups or the NGOs who are trying to support working children and helping them, they'll be told they have to get out of work. And if they don't want to leave their jobs or they need the money or whatever the reason is that they're working, they have to keep hidden from these support groups. Children are deprived of the opportunity to learn about their family enterprises. This is particularly true in plantations and agriculture. One of the examples given was in Rwanda, where lots of the tea is family plantations, and the families assume that the children can take part in this activity as they do all other agricultural activities. However, if children are seen on the tea plantations, the US Department of Labor will blacklist Rwandan tea because child labor is involved. So the children can use machetes right next to the tea plantation to cut fodder for the animals and raise the animals. That's okay because that's not economic work. If they're seen picking tea leaves, this is child labour to be abolished. So again, you get these strange anomalies. The discourse of abolishing child labour really denigrates the efforts of children who are trying to improve their lives through work. And I think that's one of the key issues. So what does this mean, when this comes to my time, for research? Well, oh gosh. We need to attend to competing calls on children's time in a changing world, particularly how their traditional activities relate to school and how these sometimes interfere with each other. We need to study different kinds of learning outside school as well as learning in school, and not just associate education solely with school. We need to consider not only the harm that arises from work, but also the benefits, and particularly the psychosocial benefits that derive from work. The way work helps resilience and various other things, and particularly self-esteem. We need to consider the significance of the social relations surrounding work, and how the work can contribute to these, and how disrupting the work can disrupt these. And we need to assess harm and benefits against each other, not simply try and divide work into harmful and beneficial. And I think finally we need critically to assess right and interventions in relations to outcomes in children's lives. Carl Hansen and others have recently pointed out that for many years research on child rights has always focused on gaps between what is contained in the convention and what is happening in practice. What we also need is research on implementation of the convention and different kinds of implementation and how it affects children's lives. So we need a critical assessment of what the rights and to determine what really their rights are, as opposed to what outsiders think their rights should be. And close off, reflecting on what Ginny was commenting before and what we were saying yesterday about power relations. You remember she commented about the country teams finding it very difficult, or accepting the traditional concept of child labour and finding it very difficult to accept a more nuanced attitude to children's work. What's happened here? The concept of child labour has built up in the dominant societies. It relates very much to their history and the history of the exploitation of children in the industrial age. And people understand child labour as something harm, something we've grown out of, something we shouldn't allow. Then we find similar patterns in other societies. So how do we rescue children from that sort of thing? You get an intervention and you get new ideas being imposed on others. I've often heard in Zimbabwe it said, child labour is a Western problem. It's not ours. We know that children benefit from work and they should work. We don't think of child labour as being a problem. Well, it is a problem sometimes. But anyway, more and more people involved through NGOs, through academic work, took on this idea that children shouldn't work, different ideas of childhood. And now, the impact of these interventions come back to academics studying them, and we start reflecting and saying, hey, wait a bit, we've got to modify our ideas. Now, the modified ideas get passed out again, and it looks like another form of colonialism. And I think that was Ginny was saying, how do we impose these on the country teams? But you can't impose them on country teams. But I think it illustrates the fact that dialogue has to take place. There are power relations which we can't get over. universities that have resources are going to dominate universities that don't. I mean, I can think of academics that I have met, junior academics, and the only literature they have access to are the free literature on the internet, and it's really problematic for them to get the academic articles. You know, the universities don't have the funds, they don't have the funds. And so that's what they cite. I remember one workshop we were having on children's work in Dakar. We had a number, about 20-odd junior academics, doctoral or postdoctoral students, and we were discussing various things. I remember one person as we were walking saying, "Ooh, this is very exciting. I didn't know we were allowed to say things like that." And I mean, yeah, it illustrates a problem people have of trying to get into a system with limited resources, with limited backgrounds, and some of them do very well at it. I mean, we know. I've had students who know much more, and I defer to them on lots of topics, much brighter than I ever was. But for quite a number of students, they are struggling. You're in a very competitive situation, you've got to get jobs. Research comes from people who have particular ideas. Most of the funding for research on children's work come from organizations which have a political policy. And there is a real problem in getting a wider, balanced view. I mean, I can't think of how many times I've given a talk and people have all agreed with me, but when they go outside, you've got to be careful what you do and where's your research come from. Or one UNICEF chap said, well, Zimbabwe's just recently raised its minimum age of employment, and I was discussing it with a couple of UNICEF people, and all agreed that this is not good for children in our economic climate. It's not going to do any good at all. It makes the government look good. And I said, right, what's UNICEF going to say about it? And one of them replied, it's very difficult, because if we criticize it, it will be like supporting child labor. And with that, thank you.